I'm Heather Gatney, and I'm the coordinator of the CVFS webinar series. Our host today is Sarah Otto Bronner, Associate Professor with the Department of Sociology at McGill University. Sarah is going to describe the process of developing the seasonal work history calendars to study women's employment in the CVFS. Sarah will also provide some illustrations of how to analyze these data alone and in combination with other CVFS data. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation. We ask that you remain muted until then. During the Q&A, you may unmute and ask your question, or you can submit a question at any time today using the chat feature. We'd also like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this point. A recording of this webinar and the slides will soon be available on the CVFS website. So it's now all yours, Sarah.
I'm now sharing my screen. Thank you very much for the invitation to present these work history calendars in this format. I'm really excited about these opportunities to get more people engaged with the CVFS data. So if you're watching this and have questions at the end that don't get answered, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I love talking about these data. I want to start by thanking some very important people who helped make this happen. First is Dirga Gamiri, who works tirelessly on all of these data collections beyond what I think he agrees to do at the beginning of them. Of course, the ISERN staff and the CVFS respondents themselves. So today's talk, I'm going to start by giving you an overview of the 2016 Female Labor Force Participation and Child Outcomes Data Collection. This was the overall data collection that included the work history calendars inside them. Then I'll spend some time more specifically on the calendars, giving you a few descriptive findings, do some basic comparisons with the DHS and the Nepal Labor Force Survey, talk about linking with other CVFS components, a little bit about our future data collection plans, and then the Q&A. So thanks to Emily's presentation a few weeks ago, we already learned a fair bit about this data collection. This was the 2016 Female Labor Force Participation and Child Outcomes Data Collection. The main focus of this data collection effort was to gather data helpful in understanding how the shift in women's employment, specifically thinking about this global increase in women working outside of the home for pay, how that shift has been is related to changes in the family. And here we were specifically interested in child outcomes. So this data was led by three different it was organized by three different PIs, each of whom contributed pilot funding. The Brown University component was added on, and I don't know much about that specifically, so I can't really answer any questions about that. Dirga Gamiri and Sarah Baird at George Washington University were also instrumental in the creation of the questionnaire and in some of the work that has come out of the data collection since then. And then we had funding from our respective universities. And as Emily discussed, it received IRB approval from Michigan and NHRC. So the interviews were done between May of 2016 and March 2017, and I include the Nepali dates here because those are important for when we're referencing the calendar to think in Nepali years. This work history calendar was done, as I've said, in conjunction with the child health data collection. Interviewers used paper and pencil for collecting the calendar information and CAPI for the accompanying survey that came along with it. The interviewers were primarily ISERN staff. Well, not primarily, they were ISERN staff for the mother interviews, but the child health data collection was also supported by local nurses and UNICEF training. So the instrument included several different components. It included the work history calendars that I'll talk about today, which had not been used before. A survey of the mothers and about themselves and about their children, anthropometric data on the children. And the survey was a combination of existing CVFS questions and validated questions from other surveys where possible, but we did also have new questions. Everything was piloted and we did full pretest in non-CVFS neighborhoods within the Chitwan Valley. And mothers gave written informed consent. So I'm talking about mothers a lot because that was who the sample was. We defined our sample based on children though. So it was mothers of children ages 0 to 17 years old who were residing in CVFS households in CVFS neighborhoods. And they could be permanently residing there or temporarily residing there. That both situations would have been included in our data collection. So that was our sample definition. And what instruments did we use in this data collection? So first, because we're interviewing mothers, we have the mother questionnaire. This was a very short questionnaire. It included some very basic information on self-reported health, highest grade of school completed, participation in clubs and groups. We had some questions about their work experience, days, hours, and earnings in the last month or week, a couple of questions trying to get at their job satisfaction, and a question asking why they weren't working if they were not working. There was also a small section about marriage that included marital arrangement, which was the standard set of questions that we use in the CVFS, also spouse's education and spouse's current employment status. Then there was the work history calendar, which I'll talk about more in the next slide, and the child sheets, which included the health questions that Emily presented on a few weeks ago at this seminar series, a few questions on childcare, pretty basic questions about who would care for the children if you needed to leave them alone. And then there was a section on education for older kids. This was the kids' education, also the mother's expectations about their children's education, work, and marriage are included there. But the reason that we are all here is to talk about the work history calendars. So this is a sample. Don't worry, I won't make you look at that hard to read picture. Everybody can see this, hopefully can see this Excel document now, which shows the work history calendar. So we can take a closer look at it. So the work history calendar is an adaptation of the life history calendar method following from the neighborhood history calendars that the CVFS really pioneered in the late 1990s. These history calendar methods are important data collection tools because they allow for more reliable collection of retrospective data. And the visual format is really what helps with this. So seeing how the different work events are related to one another, and also seeing how work events are related to the timing cues that are put on the calendar. One thing that's different with these work history calendars compared to the other history calendars that the CVFS has used in the past is, is that early on, we decided that the work history calendars needed to collect information on a quarterly basis. Because work is often seasonal, it seemed important to not just ask for a yearly calendar, which would mask the important temporal variation that we want the calendars to pick up. Asking monthly may have been preferred in some ways, but it also seemed like it would add tremendously to respondent burden and interview time, so we settled on a quarterly calendar. Okay, so let's get into the calendar. So up here at the top, we have the Nepali English and animal years. Of course, the Nepali and English years don't match perfectly, which might raise some questions for users of the data. And down here, we have rows for seasons and months. These are the Nepali year divisions, like, sorry, I'm having. So the Nepali year doesn't really fit perfectly with the way that we have broken up the seasons in this way. So because Chaitra is the last month of the year, but Baisakh and Jyeshtha are the first and second months of the next year, but they're the there's sort of these months in here. And I'm realizing as I'm saying this that unfortunately I pulled up the wrong version of this calendar that doesn't have the Nepali months, but the Nepali months in the spring season are Chaitra, Baisakh, and Jyeshtha. So which creates a tiny bit of complication with calendar years, but it's workable, certainly. Okay, so the next section that I think is important to point out with the calendars is some of the pre-filled timing events that we put in. We have national events. You can see the first election, the second election. You have the earthquake that happened in 2015. And then you have the local events that would have been pre-filled before the interviews as well. So you can see, so I just realized as I'm scrolling that these calendars can be quite long. So they're balanced on either end with the row heading so that the interviewer and the respondent can look easily to whichever side they want when they're filling this in. The next section is when we start getting into personal information for the respondent. So the first row here is these personal memorable events. And you can see we have some codes of common events that would have been filled into this row: marriage, going to school, traveling, somebody dying, the birth of a child, that kind of thing. And those are the first way to help respondents start completing these calendars and figuring out how their life is going to be written down in this format. This then brings us to the work history section of the calendar itself. So you can see we have 3 different types of jobs that we asked about: salaried jobs, wage labor jobs, own business, and then we have this 4th other section. These job categories are the ones that CVFS has historically used when collecting work information. So we felt it was important to have some comparability between this data collection effort and earlier data collections, which is why we chose them. At the bottom here, you can see we did gather slightly more detailed information for these categories. For each, for salary type jobs, we reported whether it was a government office, non-governmental office job, private office. For businesses, we code for self-employment, it's for whether it was inside or outside the home, and some basic codes for wage labor too. Agricultural work on someone else's land, domestic work on someone else's house, and then in a shop or store. So for each of these job types, we asked them whether they were working in that quarter. If they were working, how many days did they work in that quarter? And how much income did they earn from that job in that quarter? We included a column at the bottom for which job did people spend more time on. It turns out that very rarely were women working in more than one type of job. So this information, it was important to know, but it was a very rare event. Okay. So let's see. Oh, one last thing to note, sorry about the calendar, is that We collected the data collection occurred throughout 2073. So all women have at least the first, have some information for this first quarter, but they may have been interviewed during this first quarter. So when we have used the data subsequently, we tend to only use the calendar information up to 2072 because the 2073 is not complete for all respondents. But what this means at the end of this data collection is that we have 8 full years of quarterly employment information for mothers in our CVFS neighborhoods, mothers of children under the age of 17. Okay, so what do we learn from these calendars? I can give you a little taste. I think one really interesting thing that these calendars bring to our knowledge about women's work and also to our to the CVFS as a composite of data is that we could use the calendars in much the same way that other life history calendars have been used. You could estimate hazards of working or not working. You could use work as a time varying variable. These are common ways that we users of these data have benefited from the life history calendar data collections in the past. But for work, one really interesting thing that we're able to do is to really examine how work changes over time for individual women. And we have started doing that by generating these work trajectory plots. So these plots that we're going to look at are essentially kind of fancy Excel sheets where each row in this chart is an individual respondent, and her data for each quarter is recorded as being, and for this one, we've coded women as either being not employed, in a salary job, in a wage labor job, or self-employed. And so what we can see here with this big swath of tan, or sort of gray pink, I'm not sure what color that's coming up on your screen, is that most women were unemployed throughout the entire 8 years of the work history calendar. In fact, roughly half of the women were unemployed or not employed in a more technical, precise way, were not employed for this entire period. So to see what's actually happening with the different kinds of work, we created a work trajectory plot that removes those women who did not work at all over this calendar. And here you can still see a large amount of not being employed, but there are a few other features that start to jump out. The first is the seasonal aspect of wage labor. So wage labor is shown here in blue, and you can see that in the rainy months, this is much more common. You see more women reporting that they were working in wage labor in the rainy months, and then in the winter, far fewer women are working. There's always some amount of wage labor with these women kind of going across the top, consistently working wage labor, but it's much less than is working in the heavy agricultural seasons. We see that self-employment, on the other hand, self-employment and salaried employment tend to be fairly consistent. Once women start those jobs, they tend to stay in them throughout the rest of the calendar. I said that we also collect information on the number of days that women were working in each quarter, so we can create similar trajectory plots, but here we're looking at the number of days they worked, not just whether they worked in each quarter. So the darker the blue, the more days that somebody would have worked in that quarter. This is for a paper that I'm working on with 2 amazing graduate students here at McGill, Winnie Yang and Carling. And for that paper, we've tried to kind of back out whether or not some women were not working because they were so young that they were actually enrolled in school. So that's why we have this green in school category that you'll see across these figures. So this is a work trajectory plot showing the number of days per quarter that women worked for all workers. And we can break this out by looking at the different types of work that women were doing. So here you have women who were working in salary jobs. So this ends up being 291 of the original women. And I'm just realizing I don't think I told you the sample size. But you can go back to this slide and you can see that the sample is 2,046 women. Apologies, those were the women that, the mothers that were interviewed. So here we have the trajectory plot for days worked in a quarter for women with salaried jobs, and you see a fair amount of dark blue. So these women are working fairly intensely when they're in the quarters that they're working. Here you have self-employment, and it's quite similar. It's a lot of intense work. You see self-employment seems to be a little bit more consistent across the board, whereas salaried women, you see a bit of a drop off later on in some of the salaried women's employment. But what's really notable is when you look at women's wage labor. So not only are women who are working wage labor working inconsistently throughout the year, when they are working, they're not working very much. So they're working, 1 to 7 days per quarter, right? So that's for every 3 months. So this is a very low work commitment that most women who work wage labor jobs are experiencing. And that matters for things like earnings too. So we did collect how much people earned per quarter, and we so I have plotted this across the board for women who were working. Again, a darker color means higher earnings, and this is for all workers. Here you see women with salaried employment and self-employment, and you can see the colors get much darker with self-employment and much, much lighter for wage labor. So there isn't a lot of variation over time in how much women earn. The real variation has to do with the combination of earnings and work commitments. So it's really kind of like a per day difference that you're seeing come out when you're looking at these differences over time. And you're seeing that even this difference for women with wage labor is not just because they're working less, so they're earning less, but they're also being paid less per day that they are working. Okay, so that's what we found with these data, but I think, one might wonder how good of a job we did with this data collection, or how, of course, we can't test whether this is correct. We assume it's correct, but we can see how well it matches up with other data collections that have been done in Nepal. And so the first comparison that I did is with the 2016 Nepal DHS. So of course, these are different data collections with different samples. Nepal, the DHS is women aged 15 to 49. We actually had some older women in our sample because we defined our sample based on just the age of children, and we had some women who weren't currently married. So what I'm showing you now is for a subsample of the 2,046 women in our data that are married women age 15 to 49 with children age 0 to 17, so that the sample better matches with the DHS. And what we see is that 38% of women in our data had worked for pay in the past 12 months, and comparable, 62% did not. So how does that compare? Well, at first glance, it looks like it doesn't match very well with the DHS. DHS for all women in Nepal found that only a quarter had worked for pay in the past 12 months. If we compare our work history calendar information to the Nepal DHS for province 3, we see much more comparable results. So they found that 38% of women had worked with married women of this age group had worked for pay for the past 12 months, and we also did. Great. So then I went to see, well, what about some of the...
By the way, in province 3, Chitwan is within a province 3.
Yes.
That's why Sarah is comparing here.
Yes, sorry. I think the phone distracted me from making that point. Yes, Chitwan is in province 3, which is why I've chosen that for this comparison. So I wanted to see how our data collection compared with more detailed information about work. So I tried to make a comparison just about wage labor for the same women. So here, this is the percent of women who had worked in the past 12 months, what percent of them had worked in wage labor. And for us, we found that 44% of the women who were working in the past year had done so in wage labor. And how does this compare to the DHS? Very differently. So the full DHS reports that 90% of women had worked in wage labor, in sort of what they don't call it wage labor. So what I've done is I have pulled together their work categories for agriculture, domestic work, sales, unskilled manual labor, and other, which I felt was the most comparable to what we have in our data that we call wage labor, which is listed here. So Nepal DHS says that 90% of women had done that type of work in the past year. And it's still quite high for province 3, 84%. So I thought, well, let's see if we can kind of adjust these definitions a little bit. And so I removed sales and working in shops to really just try to get at the agricultural work. And even in this version, you're still seeing much higher estimates within the DHS than we're seeing. So clearly they're capturing something with sales that is not, I think just doesn't exist maybe in Chitwan to the same level. I wasn't able to separate out agricultural work on its own to just compare that to agricultural work on its own. But I think what really is happening here is that the DHS may be actually including work you did on your own household's farm that is somehow work for pay. And we explicitly do not include that in our data collection. So that's what I think this is, as somebody who's not extremely familiar with the DHS. But if people have other thoughts, I would love to hear them about why we might be seeing this discrepancy. Maybe in the Q&A, we can talk about that. Okay, so another data source that I found to compare to is the Nepal Labor Force Survey done in 2017-2018. So I was not able actually to access the microdata for these. So the numbers that I'm reporting today are based on the official report. So I don't have the kind of ideal comparisons I would like to make, but we do have some ways of comparing. So we're going to look at some slightly different numbers here. We don't need to limit our age range anymore for our data collection. So we are back up to our full sample of 2,046, but the labor force survey doesn't have any restrictions on marital status or birth parity in their reports. So their sample is going to be a broader sample of women. And also they are reporting on employment experiences in the past week, whereas our most precise information is going to be for the last quarter. Okay, so with this definition, we get 37% of women worked in the last quarter. And the Nepal Labor Force Survey found 23% for the whole, for all of Nepal, but 33% for province 3. Again, so when we narrow down to similar areas for any work, we're getting quite similar estimates. Yes. For agricultural work, we can look at all of Nepal. They didn't publish that just for province 3, but for agricultural work, it's not terrible. Okay, so one interesting thing that the Nepal Labor Force Survey is able to do is to separate out people who are unemployed from those who are just not in the labor force. So more technical, the technical definition of being unemployed is you still have to be looking for work in order to be considered unemployed, whereas many women may not be interested in working, may not be looking for work, and so would not be considered to be unemployed by these formal definitions. So this brings us back to the first slide of this comparison of just kind of, did you work for pay? And in fact, they find that almost all of the not working for pay, not employed, is not being in the labor force. And so another question that I have for the Q&A, if nobody else has questions, is, whether we think substantive leave for research questions, I guess this is an important distinction to try and make. We have added a question for our future data collection, but trying to think about getting, is this something we can collect retrospective data on? Is it important? How important? That kind of thing. With the Nepal Labor Force Survey, we can also look at earnings differences. So we have, for the women who worked in the past month, this is the distribution of earnings. You can see it's quite low. And when you compare it to the Nepal Labor Force Survey, we get a very, very different distribution of earnings. So there are a couple of things that I think learn from this. One is that probably our very simple, how much did you earn in this quarter, is not the best, most accurate way of collecting financial information for households. I'm not sure we've learned that or just confirmed that idea with this data collection. But I do think that what we learn is that, much of the work that's happening in Chitwan is this wage labor at low levels of commitment and low earnings. So while many mothers are working in Chitwan, they're rarely making a large financial contribution to the household. And that's, I think, an important thing to be thinking about. Okay, so what about linking the work history calendars to other CVFS components? When it's one of the benefits of using these data is you can, there's so much there, you kind of get whatever you want. So the easiest ones to merge with are the other data collections that were done at the exact same time as the work history calendars. So this is the female labor force participation and child outcomes mother data, the individual survey that I talked about. This is very easily merged. 100% of women who did the survey did the work history calendar, and it's just by their respondent ID. Then there's the child outcomes data set. That also all these children have mothers in the work history calendar and in the individual survey data. One note is that at least the version of the data I have, you have to change the mother ID from the child outcomes to merge to the respondent ID in the mother level files. So I don't know if we give advice about merging when we release these data to ICPSR, but that might be a thing to note. That this is the ID to use to merge to mothers. We can also merge to other individual, to many other of the Nepal data sources. So we have the 2016 individual interview, the CD data. So I have put, one side note is I have put the kind of official ICPSR dataset numbers and names on this slide, but it is possible that when I was actually doing these merges, I didn't have the very, very final released version. So if you are doing this on your own and you get something different, feel free to reach out to me so we can figure out maybe why there are inconsistencies in merge rates. So almost all of the women interviewed in the 2016 female labor force participation and child outcomes data collection were also part of this larger individual interview. And so we can get 96% merged on by respondent ID. Just to give you a little bit of detail about how different those few women are who didn't merge on, I have some of the basic information here from the women's survey in connection with the work history calendar. And what we see is that those who merged, which is this column here, were more likely to have had their marriage arranged by their parents and slightly more likely to be currently married. But in general, we're not really seeing big differences. None of the other differences are statistically different. I guess this self-reported health was a little bit worse among the women who merged. Okay, so you can also go back a little bit farther in time. Until quite recently, I thought these were the only individual interview data we had access to, actually. So if you go back to the 2008 individual interviews, which have they have complete life history calendars for everybody interviewed and a huge range of attitudinal information, lots of really interesting information. About half of our mothers were interviewed, slightly more than half of our mothers were interviewed in 2008. So you can merge back fairly easily with them. For household information, in preparing for this presentation, I tried to merge the work history calendar data to this, what I thought was the time for agricultural migration survey calendar data. So I was only able to successfully merge 81%. But I'm not quite sure why. I feel like there should be it should be a much higher merge rate, especially because at some point I had a household data set that I thought was from time 4 that had over 3,000 households in it, where I could successfully merge 94% of women. So I'm not exactly sure what there might be more household information that we have available to merge with these women, and I'm not 100% sure what's going on there. But again, you can go farther back in time and look at the time 3 data and merge 56% of the women to time 3 data as well. For the neighborhood level, we have complete matching for the 2016 neighborhood location. So for all neighborhood level information, you can merge all of these women to all of that: school history calendars, work history calendars, using the closest neighborhood and the neighborhood history calendar information. All of that kind of stuff can be merged in. Okay, so where are we going now? We have a planned data collection of a project called Women's Work and Child Wellbeing. Hopefully we'll be in the field this year. We're getting very, very close. And we are planning another round of data collection for the work history calendars as part of this. Emily talked about this data collection as well in her child health presentation, so I won't go into it too much. But I will say that the sample will be slightly different. We're going to be focusing just on mothers of children ages 0 to 10, so not 0 to 17. It's due to budget constraints. And we're going to make a couple of changes to the instrument. So we're going to add some information to the mother questionnaire so we can get educational completion, add some more work attitudinal questions, satisfaction questions, trying to learn a little bit more substance about women's work and about the work-family conflict that women are experiencing. We have a few questions to get at household decision-making, and then household wealth, primarily measured by consumer durables. And of course, the work history calendars, which I'll talk a little bit more in the next slide. Some things that we're going to remove from the 2016 data collection are, oh, sorry, I didn't get that part. And then we have the child sheets. And as Emily said, the big addition here for the child data collection is the child development questions for the ages and stages questionnaire. So we're going to cut a few pieces of information from the 2016 instrument. For mothers, we're really just cutting questions about whether they had participated in groups and clubs. And for kids, we're cutting the education piece because we're not interviewing kids who are in this age group. We are adding information to the work history calendar. We're going to ask some questions about benefits. So do people have paid maternity leave or unpaid leave, health benefits, pensions, other allowances? We're going to try to get some more detailed information on occupational categories, the type of contract that people have, and collect retrospective information on husband's work. Okay, I'm almost done. We have successfully published one paper using the 2016 work history calendar data that came out in 2019. And then the figures that I showed earlier are part of work I'm doing with these graduate students here, Mothers' Work Trajectories in Nepal, which I'm really hoping will be public. Well, it has to get under review soon, but it will be under review soon. And I think I will, given the time, stop there. Merci. If you have any questions, this is my email address. Feel free to email me. I love talking about these data, so I'm always happy to do so.
Geez, Sarah, thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate you putting this together. I think I've known about these data for years, but this is the first time that I've really had it all in one place at one time, and it's super helpful. As you might guess, I'm super excited about the merging work that you did. As you might guess, I'm very excited to see the high rate of match to the women included in the composite international diagnostic interview of mental health disorders. Finding a ton of interesting stuff out about those folks. We just got our first polygenic risk score for major depressive disorder for that data set. I think there's going to be some really cool stuff we can do to link those two data sets to do new research that looks at stuff going on in both directions. Mental health issues impairing work, work impairing mental health strikes me as super interesting. And of course, this is all a nice pre-pandemic version of those stories, which now we get to look at how the pandemic has altered those. I had a couple questions about the comparison to other data sets.
Yeah.
You know, I don't do much of that because I don't, trust anybody else's data. But I thought I learned two potentially important things I want to check out with you. Thing one, you use two different national studies of Nepal to, I believe, clearly demonstrate that women's work patterns in Chitwan are different than the rest of the country. And that if you wanted to compare between CVFS data on work, wages, earnings, et cetera, there's really no point in looking at the whole Nepal. You should only look at, sorry, was it region 3, district 3, something 3?
Province 3.
Yeah.
Province 3. It sounds to me like some sort of bad sci-fi movie that my kids would love. That was instructive to me. That seemed unequivocal, and made me want to go back through your slides and get rid of all the stuff that wasn't province 3, because why do we care? And then I got to ask you about some of the other differences, particularly that one in wages intrigued me, because the whole reason we do a life history calendar is we think it provides better measures. And, that forced me to try and think to myself, what do we mean by better measures? And I suppose the intent of the life history calendar is to help people, in your case, women, remember stuff that they might not otherwise report if they weren't asked in a way that was so cognitively engaging across time. And so when I saw this specific one, thank you, that showed this high rate of learnings, I'm like, yeah, because you got a whole bunch of respondents to report these short-term temporary wage labor jobs that respondents to the other two surveys didn't report. That was my first reaction. I don't know. So those were both, sort of like off the cuff reactions. What do you think about them?
Yes, I definitely agree that that Nepal is incredibly diverse and that we need to be careful about making statements about all of Nepal. And so but I still think that what happens in Chitwan is relevant for the rest of Nepal, because Chitwan itself is very diverse, right? And so often the diversity that you see in other regions is so closely tied, I think, to ethnicity and caste, and we can look at some of those differences precisely within our data. So I don't think it means that our findings are really only relevant to province 3, and province 3 itself is kind of weird. It's Kathmandu and Chitwan. Like, I don't know.
Oh, yeah. If I may, I come from this world of having every journal I've ever written to say, who cares about Nepal,
right?
Let alone province 3.
Right.
I think the only way I've ever had success convincing anybody to read anything that we wrote with these data is that somehow we're testing a hypothesis or studying an association or studying a relationship that others around the world should care about. But you've got a mess of those here, right? I mean, particularly given what appears to be the excellence with which you measured these short interval, short duration, temporary work engagement of women who might otherwise appear to be you said it better than I. Unemployed is not a good word.
Yeah,
not working. Thank you.
Working. Yeah.
And so I'm like, yeah, actually, isn't this calendar data better than those other measures for testing any kind of hypotheses about how women's work behaviors outside? And it is interesting, right? I thank you for including self-employed. That's the way my mother trained me at a young age in Chitwan. My father did too, to be pretty clear that all women were working harder than all men. And it was just a question of whether they were getting paid for it and whether it was outside the home or not, but it wasn't not working. And so, with that framework, I'm like, oh, it seems super important to study the associations with other behaviors, other outcomes. I love some of the attitude stuff you're adding to this new round with those temporary work spells and the short-term work compared to the longer-term work engagement. And I assume adding measures of other sorts of benefits will show more of the same, that there's a whole bunch of women who are getting none of those benefits because they're in and out of the labor force with high frequency with short duration. Seems great to me.
Thanks. I thought so too, which is why we did the data collection.
And I assume one reason you didn't compare those cool color-coded graphy things with the other data sets is because they can't make those anyway.
Oh no, there's no way. Like, they don't have that kind of detailed information. I mean, I don't know what's in the Nepal Labor Force Survey. It says you can download their data, but you cannot. So I would imagine that they collect quite detailed information, but a lot of them, it is a real challenge to collect retrospective data on work, particularly when people are doing these short spells. And so often surveys really limit to what's happening now and just assume that you'll be getting enough variation to pick that up. I think in a place like Nepal, what you get is, the season that you collect the data is just going to drive that. And so,
and actually, I'm not opposed to that framework if you don't have the wherewithal to mount a calendar data collection, because I would think that your underreporting problems would be even more severe if you asked for longer periods. So I get why they make that decision, but I didn't see any of those things in those comparisons that led me to believe that the data you've collected here is either biased in some way other than whatever these province 3 differences might be, nor did I see anything that suggests that the other data that you're comparing to could address the same kind of questions that you could address with the data you've collected here.
Yeah,
So this is great.
I think so too. I think that ICRN did an excellent job of collecting these data. And so what we have is, I liked seeing that first DHS comparison with us in province 3, you get almost the exact same percentage of people who worked in the past year. Like
that's amazing.
That's a really clear way, people will remember that. They might not remember how long that work spell was for, but they'll know if they did it at all. And so I feel, I feel good that we did that and that matches, and that gives me more faith. And I just, I think the data quality is so high that we can feel really good. One interesting thing that I noticed, I feel like typically you see a fair amount of variation in calendar reports. Things happen, things change. And with earnings, very little changes. Like you're like, no, I earned this much every time I worked. And so, that is interesting, which, when I showed that comparison with the earnings and ours was so different from the Nepal Labor Force Survey, I think we're not quite asking that in the right way. Or we are, and it's just a pretty steady thing.
Yeah, I mean, I so wish both that COVID would allow your data collection to move forward quickly, but I also wish you could be in Nepal for it so that you could engage with some of the respondents and talking through some of these issues and get a clear picture of why it looks that way.
Yeah.
Sarah, I have a question. Are you all looking at, in the current project that you talked a bit about, are you looking at cohort differences? Because it looked like, I am very new to sequence analysis, but it looks like you can see some effects of education, particularly when you broke out the salaried workers. And so I'm just curious if you're exploring that at all.
Yeah, so I haven't run the work trajectories by cohort. That's my to-do list for tomorrow, actually. But what we've done with these work trajectories is we've used them to predict work clusters, and then use those clusters in a multinomial model. And there we control for birth cohort. And and those analyses are really focused on ethnicity and caste, and they find that that's like hugely predictive of not being in wage labor, as one would expect. But yeah, so we do, in those analyses, we've controlled for birth cohort. And I think that you're right that like we need to be able to separate out, because we have women of this huge age range, and often you'll see trajectory analysis where it's actually age along the x-axis, and we can't do that because we don't have enough cells, really. You get this weird shaped thing. So yeah.
The other difference I'm curious about, knowing a lot about this particular data set, is that we included visitors. So we have women that this might be the first time that they're responding to a calendar versus people that are longer term CVFS respondents. So I don't know if you've looked at this at all, but I'd be curious about if we see, and I don't necessarily have ideas about how you would evaluate this either, but differences in data quality or consistency on the calendars for people that have responded, that have completed life history calendars prior, versus the women that were new respondents in this data collection?
That's a really interesting question. That would be like a great methods paper for somebody to write. We can just add that to our list, Emily.
Yes.
Yeah, and you could probably, most women would have done the CD interviews. So I don't know about the timing of those. We can look at interview dates, and then, you have the 74 women who don't merge. How many of them are new? They must all be, they're all.
I think it's a larger subset, because if I look at kids and length of how long kids have been tracked in the registry, it's a larger chunk that have been there less than 6 months. So yeah, so I'm curious. Yeah, I don't know that comparing to the CD merge is necessarily the best way to get it, this group that I'm describing. But I'm also curious if they have substantive different, if they're visitors, they're not usual residents, they may have other substantive differences in their work
I'm
history.
loving this, and I'm so sorry I have to go to another meeting.
I have to get to.
Oh my God, I have to go
but-
too.
Yeah, but this is great. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Sarah.
Sarah.
Nice to see everybody.